New this morning, the Russian capital getting a first-hand sense of war after an alleged drone attack. So you see a plume of smoke there in the center of your screen rising, and you can actually see in this next video, you see a drone flying over the city. You'll see in just a moment, see this man there pointing it out as he looks at it out of his window. There is also video that's been posted of what appears to be a fragment of a downed drone. Russian state media says 2 people were injured in Moscow and 3 residential buildings were damaged in the attack. Russian military officials are blaming Ukraine for the attack, something Ukraine denies.
We should note that attack came just hours after another aerial assault on Kyiv. Ukrainian officials say 1 woman was killed, 13 others were injured. There have been 17 attacks on Kyiv so far this month ahead of the planned counteroffensive, and officials just released this body camera video. Listen to that. Of police responding to one of the attacks, a real-time look at the daily reality of war as officers help injured civilians. Joining us now from CNN, former CNN Moscow bureau chief Jill Doherty. She's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Good morning, Jill. I'm glad you could join us last minute this morning just to get your reaction to this continued bombardment on Kyiv and then also what we saw take place in Moscow.
Yeah, I think what happened in Moscow is really significant. You know, there have been attacks by apparently Ukrainians over the border close to Ukraine. But this is Moscow. This is a big deal. Moscow is protected by very serious air defenses. And they say, the Russian officials say that these drones were shot down. But just the mere fact, remember a month ago, we had that drone, 2 drones that went over the Kremlin. And the Kremlin in the beginning wasn't quite sure how to deal with it. Kind of the same thing here. They haven't really been able to deal, I would say, in a propaganda way with what's happening. And, you know, if you look at the drones, the damage militarily is not really great, but the propaganda value really is. So you have the dilemma by Putin. You know, you could say, he has to admit that the war is expanding and that it's hitting the Russian capital. That's very bad for him politically. On the other hand, I think what you're going to see is the Kremlin trying to spin this, that the war, you know, now we have to unite. This is existential. It's for the survival of Russia, et cetera. They will use it to try to get the Russian people united. But I think it's really a very disturbing thing for Putin. It's a real problem for him.
So they'll try to spin that into some other propaganda. I found it interesting. Our CNN military analyst, Colonel Cedric Leighton, said this morning very clearly, he says this is a warning to the Russian people. How do you think the Russian people are taking it today?
Well, I've been on social media, of course, trying to figure out what they're thinking. It's kind of hard to say, but I think there's an element of shock. There's no question that drones have actually now not just kind of symbolically gone over the Kremlin, but now they're hitting neighborhoods. And I looked at a map of where those drones hit. So they're in the city and then outside, and they're in areas kind of west of Moscow where you have a lot of elite housing. The president lives out in that area. So this is really significant, even if, again, the damage is minimal, but the psychological damage, I think, is quite strong.
Jill Doherty, thank you very much.
CNN's Fred Pleitgen is in Kyiv. He's outside some buildings that were damaged, where they were damaged overnight. Fred, you spoke to the city's mayor. What is he saying today?
Hi there, Kate. Well, Vitaly Klitschko, the mayor of the city, he was absolutely irate about this drone attack. He called it terrorism on the part of the Russians. But he also said that actually the Ukrainian air defense was pretty successful, and it was successful thanks to a lot of the weapons that Ukrainians are getting from the U.S. and its allies. Let's listen in.
If we doesn't have air defense, modern air defense from our partners, we have much worse situation in our hometown. More destroyed buildings and more, it will be more civilians killed.
So one of the reasons, Kate, why Vitaly Klitschko said that, I want to show you that this building here that I'm standing in front of, this is one of the ones that sustained a lot of building because it took a hit from one of those Shahed drones that's supplied by the Iranians, but the Russians are using. You can actually hear and see that a lot of the cleanup is already going on. If we pan up, you can see that that drone crashed right into the top floors of this building. Now, one person was killed there, However, even that drone that crashed into this building was intercepted. It was intercepted by Ukrainian air defenses, and they say that it was the fragments of that drone, obviously including the warhead, that crashed into that building. But I can tell you, it was certainly a very difficult night here for the folks in the capital city. We heard those drones hovering overhead for a substantial part of the night, several hours, as Ukrainian air defenses were trying to take them out. At the same time, you do feel that resilience here in the Ukrainian capital, as now, only hours later, the cleanup is going on and people are trying to go about their daily lives. This, of course, comes as Ukraine seems to be on the cusp of that counteroffensive, and Ukraine's president now saying the timing of that offensive has now been decided. Kate?
Yeah, not telling exactly when, but that it has been decided. And just to be clear, that's cleanup? That's people throwing, like, debris off the rooftop behind you, Fred?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on. There was substantial damage to the top floor apartments there, and now they're sort of clearing the debris, throwing it down to then be able to clean it up as fast as possible. They are pretty quick at doing that now. Unfortunately, they have a lot of practice after a lot of the strikes that have happened here over the past year.
That's a great point. Unfortunately, they've become very good at that cleanup very quickly. Thank you, Fred Pleitgen, on the scene for us. John.
All right, with us now is retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack. He is a global fellow at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and served as the U.S. Senior Defense Attaché to the Russian Federation. General, look, I want to start with the drone attacks on Moscow up here, which here's the Ukrainian border, about 300 miles, depending on what direction you go, from inside Ukraine. I want to show people the sites inside Russia or in Russian-controlled territory that have been hit over the last several weeks. You can see most of the areas have to do with the Russian occupation directly of Ukraine, either supply areas or Russian-held territory inside Ukraine. Moscow stands alone as a much different target. Now, the Ukrainians deny direct involvement, but what do the drone attacks in Moscow do for the Ukrainians, even if they didn't do it?
Good morning, John, and to your viewers. Yeah, it is highly significant. What we have going on here is that the Russians are being fed a narrative about the justness of this the special military operation, and they're going to prevail. Yet they just had the Kremlin, however it happened, hit last month. They've just had Moscow and the suburbs hit now, and the drones are coming from somewhere. It's an extreme range for, if you will, the Ukrainian organic drones, Tochka or the Bayraktars from Turkey, if they were far from the border. But the bottom line is that they can't hide the war from, if you will, call the cities now what I would call mainstream Russia. The bill payers for most of the war in Ukraine have been troops from the provinces, but now they're having to deal with it. And the military bloggers are out there. Prigozhin has already lambasted the military again just a few hours ago for their ineffectiveness in defending the motherland and all. So this is very disconcerting for Putin and the Kremlin. In trying to keep, if you will, a stable narrative. It's a big deal, much bigger than the actual sum of the strikes.
Yeah, and again, and this is some video of what the strike looked like inside Moscow. That type of image is seen in Kyiv almost every time, several times a day. This is some of the video on the attacks on Kyiv, which have been relentless, frankly, over the last several days, day and night. Why are the Russians striking now with such ferocity in the Ukrainian capital?
I think for several. First of all, I was there with a delegation of the Renewed Democracy Initiative, an NGO focused on countering authoritarianism worldwide, domestically. Now here, I think it's a bunch of reasons. One, there's fury, there's anger that's been going on now for months, but especially after Kremlin strike. There's a side of the Russians, John, that I believe they want the Ukrainians to submit. It's a word that's almost medieval, submit, and they aren't. And the more the Ukrainians fight back and the more the Ukrainians create problems in the area, the harder it gets. And they haven't figured it out. I also think increasingly the Russians are now they're really nervous about all the talk about a counteroffensive and the preparations. the shaping operations, everybody. And so that's going on. So they're lashing out in a way. And the thing that's critical is that these are not hitting effectively military targets. They're primarily hitting targets where there are a lot of civilians, and they're killing. And if the Russians think that's going to make the Ukrainians submit, from our view, in my group that I was with, we were there for the first big night of the missile strikes in Kyiv on the 16th of May, when the Patriots and other things were knocking down top-notch Kinzhal Russian cruise missiles. So it's on. Ukrainians are implacable. The Russians are increasingly frustrated, and they're increasingly worried, and I think it goes all the way back to the Kremlin.
General Peter Zwack, thank you so much for helping us this morning. We'll talk to you again soon.